I'm Carmen Twillie-Ambar, president of Oberlin College and Conservatory. Welcome to Running to the Noise, where I speak with all sorts of folks who are tackling our toughest problems and working to spark positive change around the world. Because here at Oberlin, we don't shy away from the challenging situations that threaten to divide us. We run towards them. When Tom Dietterich earned his math degree from Oberlin in 1977, artificial intelligence systems couldn't learn or adapt. They simply followed rules. Over the next few decades, Tom helped change that. He became one of the pioneers of machine learning, the technology that allows AI to make sense of data, spot patterns, and make decisions. Today, it powers everything from Siri on your phone to the algorithms planning your commute, recommending your next podcast, or helping doctors develop targeted medical treatments. Tom's work has made him a sought-after authority. He advises the U.S. government on AI technologies and has earned some of the field's top honors. His research has shown how data and algorithms can solve real-world problems, improving wildfire management, protecting endangered species, enhancing agricultural productivity, and advancing drug development. When machine learning technologies leap from the lab into daily life, Tom's liberal arts education helped him step back and ask the bigger questions. How will AI shape our institutions? How will it affect our understanding of ourselves? And what ethical responsibilities come with creating machines that learn and help make decisions that increasingly impact our lives? In this episode, I speak with Tom, Distinguished Professor Emeritus at Oregon State University, about the power and the peril of artificial intelligence, and why the real challenge of AI isn't what it can do, but what we choose to do with it. I'm so excited to have Tom Dietterich here today because we rolled out a year of AI exploration at Oberlin this year as a campus-wide initiative that will include lots of speakers, workshops, opportunities for people to think about the impact of AI and all the work that they do. Obviously thinking about environmental impact and privacy impact, but also thinking about how this technology might reshape higher education, what things we can take from it that we feel really positive about, and what things we should be concerned about. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you because I think it fits within that AI theme. And I'm hoping you can help us think in more clear-eyed ways about this technology and what it means. Tom, I guess I wanted to start with whether you think it's right to describe you as one of the founders of AI or machine learning. How would you think people should think about your early contributions to this technology?
I'm not a founder. I'm probably one of the first graduate students who worked in artificial intelligence. Generally, we date the sort of founding of AI to 1956, John McCarthy and Herbert Simon and people like that. And I was only 2 years old at the time. So
Okay.
I was not at that first workshop in Dartmouth. But starting in 1978 or fall 77, right after I graduated from Oberlin, I started a PhD program at the University of Illinois and later moved on to Stanford to finish my PhD. And at that point, the field of machine learning was first given its name and started to have regular meetings. So there was a workshop in 1980, 30 people. This year, I think the big AI conferences are having 15,000, 17,000 people attending. So it's been quite a ride.
I'm wondering if you can help us sort of understand what those early days were like. I think to myself, what were the courses? What were you trying to accomplish in those early days as you were thinking about machine learning and what the possibilities were like? Try to take us back to those early moments.
Of course, whenever you're programming a computer to do something, you need to somehow specify what you want the computer to do and how to do it. Ideally, you want to provide a step-by-step recipe, and we write that in a computer programming language, of course. But when people started to think about things like speech recognition or language translation, or maybe controlling a robot, things like this, we quickly realized that we had no idea how to write down the step-by-step process by which our eyes see that, oh, that's a dog running across the quad, or or that we hear something and recognize, oh, that's a Bach prelude. It happens in a part of our brains that we cannot introspect into. How are we supposed to write those programs? And so one thought was, maybe we could teach the computer, quote unquote. I
Right.
always hesitate to use these sort of human loaded words, but to provide examples of what the input should be and what the output should be, and
Okay.
then see if we could write a program that could find patterns in the input that would tell it how to produce the output. And so that was the idea of machine learning as a sort of trying to fit a function, or we would say mathematically, find a mapping between inputs and outputs.
As I was preparing for this interview, I was reading that you mentioned that when your team was teaching robots to move, literally, you were sort of falling and trying again. Like that was the way you thought about the work, trying to teach, I guess, the computer to learn how to learn, maybe. I don't know if that's the right
Well,
phrase.
no, it's just that for some tasks, like, say, language translation, we can have a sentence in Spanish and then the corresponding sentence in English because a human translator has translated it.
Right.
And we sometimes call that supervised learning. It's giving the right answer. But it's much more difficult in many tasks, and robotic motion is one of them, although I personally have not worked on that so much, but I've worked on the underlying mathematics and algorithms. Another example is in biological conservation, where you're considering what kinds of steps could we take to prevent an invasive species from taking over.
Okay.
There's no human expert that knows the right answer. So you can't just tell when you have this situation in your landscape, here's what you should do. Instead, what we tend to do is build a simulation of some kind and then have the computer test out different strategies in simulation, figure out which ones work best, and then learn how to use those to say, okay, those will be my right answers. Given an input, here's what I should do as the output.
Right.
That's known as reinforcement learning, or also the technical term is bandit feedback, which comes from the idea of a slot machine being a one-armed bandit.
Okay.
And you can only learn what payout you get from a machine by pulling the lever.
By pulling the levers and multiple times getting different answers, but ultimately arriving to the right answers through the continual pulling of the lever. Is that the concept?
Right, yes. And so, of course, with robots, it's extremely difficult to, in the physical world, have them learn by trial and error. And so we usually do that first in simulation. And one of the big advantages over the last 30 years or whatever is that we have much better physical simulators that can simulate the mechanics and friction and everything that the robot would experience. And the computer can do millions or billions of simulated experiments and
Right.
come up with a strategy for walking, let's say, that's pretty good. And then you need to test that out in the real world. Several years ago, Sony came out with this robot called the Aibo, which is the little puppy.
Yes. I remember that.
And colleagues of ours at, I think, University of New South Wales and also at Carnegie Mellon wore out the hip joints of their robots testing different ways of walking across the carpeted floor and had to have hip replacements as a result.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about one of the concerns that people raise. I'm sure you've heard lots of these around environmental issues, ethical issues, all the things that people raise as concerns with respect to AI. Maybe you could take just one of those, like the environmental impact, and give us a sense of your perspective about, should we be concerned? What should we be concerned about? And how should we analyze our progress towards dealing with those concerns?
Let's first talk about the environmental impact. I think that's actually the most tractable of the questions. Over the last few years, there's been a huge investment of capital in trying to scale up the large language model systems. Back in the early 2020s, this approach for building a large language model that's known as the transformer model was invented at Google. And initial results were quite intriguing. So people thought maybe we should just try to train them on a lot more data. And that led to GPT-3 and then GPT-4 and 5 and all of their siblings and competitors. But there was very little attention paid to making this efficient. Everybody just was curious, what kind of behavior can we get out of these systems? How will they act? I would characterize this as the brute force period.
Okay.
It just threw huge amounts of computing, huge amounts of electricity, vast quantities of water to cool the data centers, and it was very inefficient. Our colleagues / competitors in China, not having access to such high-end machines, were forced to do some innovation and were able to immediately get 20 times more efficient methods. In the meantime, NVIDIA, which makes all of the chips, not all, but the majority of the chips that are used to run these systems, has been increasing the efficiency of their chips at a very rapid pace. And so there's a huge motivation from the companies who are spending billions of dollars running these things to make them much more efficient and much cheaper and use much less energy because it's costing them real money. And it's not clear that they're making back any of that money yet because the technology is still so immature and not really being used as much as they would like. So I think that the problem of the environmental impact will, to some extent, solve itself because
just the incentives will be there in a way for these companies.
The incentives are very powerful here, right?
Yeah.
We have a lot of expertise in computer science and electrical engineering and power systems that we can bring to bear. We know how to make these things run faster. Now, the question is always, okay, what happens if demand increases exponentially? So we know that you could have the phenomenon that's very much like adding lanes to a freeway where just more people get on the freeway and you have traffic.
We've all experienced that. The freeway gets bigger and the traffic seems worse, right?
Right. We will probably see some of that, particularly if the technology turns out to be as useful as people are claiming it will be. I do think there's a deeper question. Is there a better way of building AI systems that does not rely on this massive amount of training data and these immense models? I feel like the machine learning field is in a moment of crisis in the sense of, I guess, Thomas Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions, right? He says that, a scientific field proceeds through a whole series of regular routine experimentation until things just don't seem to be working. I feel like as a machine learning researcher and engineer, I could never have imagined we would have so much capital investment into machine learning and that we would scale up these systems so large. But we have done this, and what we're finding is there are still very serious ways in which these things don't do what we want them to do.
Right.
The most famous point, of course, is hallucination. The systems make things up. The original term for hallucination really came from language translation, where there would be, say, again, going from Spanish to English, the English translation would mention something that did not appear in the Spanish original. It was just something very likely to have been there, but it wasn't there. Or in computer vision, you would ask the computer to describe a picture of, say, a bathroom that showed the sink and maybe a towel rack, and it would say, oh, there's also a mirror there. It's not in the image, but of course, there probably is a mirror in the room. It's just not visible. So that was where this term hallucination came from. It's imagining things that are not there. But more generally, of course, we've seen, I think there are more than 150 legal cases where the documents provided by the lawyers cited non-existent law cases. There are certainly lots of made-up academic citations in scientific papers. And so this is one problem. Another problem is that these systems don't seem to be able to learn abstractions that generalize. It's much closer to memorizing billions of facts and being able to interpolate between them, smooth them, but not go really very far beyond the data. A really good example is you can give a computer training examples for doing, say, multi-digit multiplication and arithmetic for 2 digits, 3 digits, up 5, 7, 8, 9 digits. No matter how many digits of examples you give, the models are not able to solve problems that are much larger. So if you train them for, say, 8-digit multiplication, they can't do 16 or 32 or anything. So they're not learning the general rules somehow. What's funny is you can ask them what the rules are, and they will tell you the rules, but they can't actually use that knowledge.
That's fascinating.
You can also ask them what are the rules of chess, but they can't play a game of chess. So that's a bit of evidence that we need a really different way of building AI systems than what we have now.
I think that's so fascinating because one of the things that's been happening on our campus, lots of concern about AI technology replacing people's jobs, eliminating the work that creatives do. On the faculty side of the house, certainly wondering whether students will not have the same critical thinking skills and cultural competency skills because of their use of AI. So I'm interested in your perspective about this notion of AI replacing kind of human thinking, because you've talked about some of its limitations and the things it really can't do. And maybe the model will be built in a way that will change that. But I'm wondering whether you have that same level of concern about how AI might sort of eliminate industries and eliminate the kind of human involvement in the work that we do.
Well, absolutely, I share those concerns. Where to begin? Writing and thinking and knowing how to construct a logically sound argument is an absolutely essential skill and something that we have to teach in our universities all the time. And we do that mostly by teaching writing. And like every academic, It is only when I sit down and try to write out my arguments clearly that I start to see all the holes in them.
Right.
And I think that it's absolutely essential that we do that. Now, the question is, particularly maybe in the earlier courses, where we assign writing assignments that are actually fairly routine. Now, the large language model systems have read all of these previous essays on the same topic, and they can generate a new one that's just yet another boring version of those. I think we have to ask, were those exercises actually helping students learn to think even in the old days? They're certainly now going to be able to outsource that thinking to these models.
So are you asking us to rethink how we think about the academic experience and what we're trying to teach students in light of this new technology? Are you suggesting that?
We still want to teach the same things, which is critical thinking, understanding how an argument is structured. What does it mean for you to have evidence, whether that's evidence in a philosophical argument or a scientific argument or a mathematical one? A weakness, actually, of these large language models is they don't understand that, what an argument is or what evidence means. So we still want to teach that, but the question is how, if it turns out that students can produce a sort of simulation of having thought through a problem, and we can't tell the difference, that means that we weren't doing it right to begin with in some sense.
And you're saying that there's probably a higher order level of teaching that we need to do so that we can help the students get to that next level of inquiry and understanding.
I mean, of course, as a teacher, we set tasks that we hope have strong pedagogical value for our students. And maybe we need to do more in-class writing. Maybe we need to do more human-human pair writing. This is where our creativity as teachers and as students needs to be brought to bear. But I totally grant it's a challenge, and a lot of our old pedagogy, at least our techniques, will have to be replaced. And that replacement is likely to be more expensive.
One of the reasons why I wanted to do this year of exploration of AI at Oberlin is because we can't ignore this technology. It is here. We would be doing our students a disservice not to help them understand it and to think about it. And that if we need to shift how we do our work in order to help better prepare our students, that this year of exploration is about figuring out how to do that. Because turning a blind eye to AI is not going to help us solve the challenges. One of the things that I really appreciate about one of the things that you've said about your own experience being here at Oberlin and how few computer scientists have a particularly liberal arts college background, that has informed the way you have thought about this technology. It has impressed upon you thinking about its ethical impacts in ways that I assume you suggest might not have been there as clearly for you if you didn't have the type of background you had at Oberlin.
The most important class I took at Oberlin was on political philosophy by Harlan Wilson. It was an extremely popular class. But for the more scientifically oriented students in his class, he said Karl Marx claimed to be a scientist. Read Marx and critique his thinking. And also go read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions for a glimpse at what was then contemporary philosophy of science. And it was really that introduction to philosophy of science that led me then in graduate school to think about machine learning. The goal of machine learning is, in some sense, to automate scientific inquiry. The central question of philosophy of science, or one of them, is how do we acquire new knowledge, learn new things about the world in a systematic and rational way? How do we go from our common sense understanding of the world to quantum mechanics through a series of rational steps? And that, I thought, was a fascinating question worthy of study. And so that really motivated me to do more reading in philosophy of science after I left. But the other thing, of course, is that one of the things you're taught at Oberlin is it's complicated. Basically, everything is complicated.
That's right.
So you take classes in history, in economics, in sociology, and it's just drummed into you that if anybody proposes a simple answer, it's got to be wrong.
One of the ways I describe the experience here is that students learn how to analyze complexity.
Well, or at least you know it's there.
Yeah, that's right.
You may run away from it if you can, but engineers often emphasizes seeking out the part of the problem that can be solved by engineering methods, by applying physics and chemistry and so on, and focusing on that and trying to ignore the larger socio-technical concerns. That was the world I lived in, I would say, for the first 10 years of my career. I was having a good time solving little mathematical puzzles in my field. doing normal science, but I was a little disappointed that they weren't leading to any real world impact. Right around 1996, I think, when I was first promoted to full professor, I thought, it's time to branch out. And so I started collaborating with ecologists here at Oregon State University.
So was that when you were modeling migrations? Is that early work?
I didn't get to bird migration for another 5 or 6 years.
Okay.
I was first working on global vegetation models because the global climate models at that time only modeled the atmosphere, and the Earth was just considered a flat surface. The question was, how about if we bring all of plant life into these models? Would that help? And so I worked with collaborators here that were doing that. And then I moved on to some other things. Eventually got connected up with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They have a big program, citizen science project, called eBird, one of the oldest, where bird watchers fill out checklists every time they go bird watching. And the question was, could we actually do any science with this so-called citizen science data? And one of the things we attempted was, can we predict bird migration and forecast when it's going to happen? Because then we might be able to make some interventions, particularly turning off lights in skyscrapers, maybe other sources of artificial light, because that really confuses the birds.
Could you talk a little bit about those parts of your research project? I know you've done some work on fires and the liability standards associated with wildfires. Maybe you could help our audience understand how AI plays a role in that type of research. Some of what concerns people is they can only see the things that make them fearful about what this technology may be. They're not as well versed as maybe you might be about some of the ways that this technology might help us do right by the planet, do right by the world. So maybe you could help our audience sort of understand some of your research in that context.
It is important to realize that there are many, many branches of artificial intelligence. It's sort of a banner that is quite confusing. Large language models are really just a small part, although they're sucking all the oxygen out of the room right now. But an area that I worked in with wildfire and also with invasive species is really the problem of management. So in both wildfires and invasive species, and really in agriculture generally, you can think of it as I'm trying to manage an ecosystem, make sure that it's functioning well, that it's not going to go extinct, and so on. We end up with a problem very similar to the robot problem we were talking about before. We don't know what the right way is to manage these systems. We build first usually a simulation. So in the case of wildfire, we were able to repurpose several and combine together big simulators that already existed, particularly something called Farsight from the U.S. Forest Service in Missoula, Montana, and then simulate different management strategies. Now, in the particular case there, we were interested in the legal question of what kind of liability rules should apply to wildfire. Right now, the usual standard is, let's say we have two different landowners who own adjacent property, and a fire starts on, say, Alice's land and burns into Bob's land. Does Alice have any obligation to pay for the damage that Bob experienced or not? So currently, the answer is no. Wildfire is treated as an act of God, and everybody just has to deal with their own property. But there was a proposal to have a liability rule, which is that Alice would have to reimburse Bob for his losses. And there was also a thought that what if Alice had taken steps to try to reduce fire risk on her property? Say, had reduced the load of accumulated fuels, which we have in our forests here in the West, at least. Then maybe she should not be liable. So we could have some incentive
for her to behave differently.
So we compared various rules. What we found was the liability rule that said Alice would be responsible for Bob was a disaster. But where does the AI come in? In simulation, simulate what would happen with various wildfires and simulate what Alice and Bob would do. What would be their...
what would be their behavior?
Their response.
Their response.
Each of them has some objectives they're trying to achieve. In this case, we're looking purely at economics. And how would they behave? And what we find is that basically fire is so rare that the optimal quote-unquote behavior is to do nothing, because chances are fire won't start on your property. And if you're hurt by it, someone else will pay for it. So you have no incentive at all. So this is really kind of applied economics, I guess, in some sense. Whereas we found that if you had that requirement that you would have no liability if you had brought your property up to a minimum standard, that was better.
And that altered behavior.
Although we still found that your risk was much less predictable under the liability scheme than under the scheme where you just have to take care of your own property no matter what.
Hmm.
Which makes sense, because if you have to take care of your own property, then you just have to live with the risks and you will do things. If there's a chance that someone else will pay for it, then you could have a much bigger or a much lower risk. And so the variability goes way up. In some sense, it's maybe a less desirable state of affairs. But, in economics, you talk about the social optimum, which is imagining one decision maker could control the entire economy.
Right.
What would be the outcome? And we found that we could approach that with this liability standard.
Interesting, because I do think that there is this sort of sense of AI as this kind of amorphous, probably evil thing that has no benefit to society. And you seem to be saying that ways that we can do large scale simulations can help us think about policies that can solve complicated problems for us in ways that we may not be able to do if we didn't have AI as a framework for thinking about this work. I guess, one other question. Oberlin has probably almost 1/3, not totally, but getting close. We have 500 students in the conservatory. We probably have 300 students in what I would describe as the practicing arts, studio art, painting, theater, sort of name kind of the practicing arts. And there's a lot of concern in the creative space, I think, particularly about impact of AI on artists and their ability to have their work used and not appropriated in the wrong way, or the ability for AI to create whole movies and storylines. And I guess I'm wondering what you would say about that space and place in AI.
It's a fascinating set of questions. It looks that existing copyright law does not really protect artists in the way that we might want them to be protected. Of course, there's a long tradition in art of making copies of the work of other artists as a form of practice and learning.
Right.
But if you try to sell those, that's generally considered forgery. I think that we maybe need new law that says not only the exact previous expression, the exact painting, the exact movie or whatever that was created, not only is that protected, but in some sense, the style, and which is going to be very hard to define.
Right.
But the style of the artist is deserving of some protection, because if I can walk into your studio, take pictures of everything, and then produce 10,000 works that are all in the same style, at a minimum, I'm going to reduce the price that anyone would pay
Price of
for
it. Right.
But that just seems like a clear case of theft.
Right.
Right now, the law says if I'm trying to pass them off as your work, that's illegal. But if I'm just saying, I just like the style, and so I decided to make a bunch of it under my name,
Right.
that's considered okay. And I don't think that's okay.
Well, I agree.
I'm less worried about AI systems in a very simple push-button way generating whole movies or news stories and things. At least with the current AI technology, it's very statistical, and it exhibits this regression to the mean phenomenon, right? It generally produces things that are pretty boring and vanilla. No offense to lovers of vanilla, but it's just that, in fact, there's going to be an increasing, economic value or maybe artistic value put on original expression because the AI stuff is not going to be good enough. Now, of course, AI in the hands of a good artist could become even more interesting, right?
Right.
I think there are all kinds of interesting pieces of art I've already seen. I follow a couple of artists in social media who use AI tools to design ceramics, which they then build and manufacture, and they just are really fascinating. So there's space, and it'll be very interesting to see how that unfolds.
Yeah, I think I heard someone say AI is not going to replace the human endeavor, but humans who don't understand how to use AI and its impact, they will have challenges. I wonder what your thinking is.
I feel like that's too much of an AI booster statement.
Yeah.
I mean, I think people will be able to make fantastic art without knowing anything about AI.
Yeah.
But some people will choose to, just as they already were using computer-based tools.
Right. Like digital artists who are using their computers. Yeah.
But what will be interesting is what they do with those tools and how they bring their humanity to it. I'm super excited to see where that takes us.
Yeah. I certainly know that we're going to have to figure out how to think about AI on a college campus in all sorts of ways, and its impact can be wide-reaching. And so I'm excited about this year of exploration because I think it will help us come to better conclusions about our own thinking about it. Also, the impact on the next iteration of teaching and learning and careers. And that's one of the things I'm hoping to accomplish in this year. So I'm wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about something your colleagues call the Computing for a Better World and Sustainable Future. future?
I co-led 2 very big grants on what we call computational sustainability.
Computational sustainability.
And I've been
Okay.
involved in some other AI for social good efforts.
We haven't heard people talk much about computational sustainability, AI for a better future. It seems like it's a little lost in these conversations about AI. So I'm wondering if maybe you could help our audience understand what those conferences have been about and what's been the purpose of them.
This area of computational sustainability was developed by Carla Gomez and myself. She was the head of this project. She's a faculty member at Cornell.
Okay.
And our vision is, how can we develop the methods in computer science to promote sustainability in the natural environment in our economic and social systems?
Okay.
Within the Sustainable Development Goals framework of the United Nations, we've funded a wide variety of different projects under this umbrella. Some of them have been like the bird migration or
Okay.
invasive species management type problems. There's been work on law enforcement for anti-poaching efforts.
Okay.
How do you model where the poachers are going and predict where they'll be using machine learning? How do you design the routes the forest wardens should take so that they are very unpredictable and have a higher probability of catching the bad guys?
Okay.
But we've also looked at things like material science. Some of the biggest potential benefits of AI are going to come in their applications in new drugs and new materials. For example, more efficient batteries, better energy transmission, all of the things we need to decarbonize the economy. Those are areas where we've already seen AI techniques provide powerful tools for predicting the structure of proteins from the basic protein sequence, the AlphaFold system from Google DeepMind and Rosetta from University of Washington.
Okay.
Back in 1991, I was involved in a startup company trying to use machine learning to do drug design. We were about 30 years too soon.
Oh.
Now there are many companies in this space, and they're starting to see real success. One project that I'm currently involved with is in weather networks. If you look at a map of the weather stations around the world, these are ground stations that just record things like temperature and rainfall and wind speeds. Those maps have huge empty spaces in South America and Africa. At the same time, through the wonders of miniaturization and electronics, we can now build weather stations that are maybe twice the size of a Coke can, but are 10 to 20, maybe 100 times cheaper than traditional weather stations. And we have cellular data networks. And I'm involved in a project called TAMO, the Trans-African Hydrometeorological Observatory, which hopes to be operating a network of, our dream is 20,000 ground weather stations across all of sub-Saharan Africa. We have 750 weather stations right now across 22 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's a nonprofit that's headquartered in Nairobi, but we have ground field technicians throughout those countries. My role, which is relatively minor in this, is to try to detect when a weather station needs to have a technician visit it and clean it and replace broken components. And so it's kind of a statistical maintenance problem, but surprisingly difficult to solve.
No, that is fantastic. For those of you regular podcast listeners, you know that this podcast was named after that statement, as Michelle Obama described Obies and Oberlin graduates and Oberlin students as people who run to the noise. Tom, I guess I'm wondering what you would say to that statement. How do you, in your work, personal life, however you want to answer the question, run to the noise?
I'm always looking for ways that I can make a difference in the world that go beyond just publishing papers and solving lovely technical problems that are fun. One of the ways that I did that was to build a network, a sort of professional social network on both my own campus and across the country of people that knew people that could introduce me to the right folks when I thought I saw an opportunity. So when I saw an opportunity to think about wildfire, for example, I contacted a person on my campus, and then she introduced me to two professors in the forestry school who were experts in that area. I guess with the Africa project, that was a sequence of more of coincidences. But a colleague of mine, a guy named John Selker, who's a hydrologist by training, is one of the masterminds behind this Africa project. And I said, "Oh, that looks cool. I bet I could help. So let me volunteer my time on that and see what we can do." Actually, I've had 3 PhD students finish, all working
Wow.
on these weather network problems.
We thank you so much for your time and for being one of those OBs that our students can look to know that what they want to achieve is possible. We will be following you and your work, and I'm sure calling on you to help us think about the year of AI exploration at Oberlin. Love for you to come and speak and help us understand your work. So be on the lookout for another phone call from us.
Okay, great.
Thanks for listening to Running to the Noise, a podcast produced by Oberlin College and Conservatory. Our music is composed by Professor of Jazz Guitar Bobby Ferraza and performed by the Oberlin Sonny Rollins Jazz Ensemble, a student group created through the support of the legendary jazz musician. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to hit that subscribe button, leave us a review, and share this episode online so OBs and other folks can find us too. I'm Carmen Twillie-Ambar, and I'll be back soon with more great conversations from thought leaders on and off our campus.